Good afternoon. If people can take their seats, we should be starting shortly. Okay, good afternoon. How are we doing today? Thank you. So this is an expert panel here. The topic of our discussion today is globalization, ensuring no one is left behind in an era of disillusionment. And in this high-level session, we will sort of challenge some perceptions against the reality of globalization and sort of try to bring forward some ideas to ensure that kind of no one's left behind in this kind of growing era of disillusionment. And we have a stellar panel here from across the world. So I'll go in the sequence from right to my left. First is Andrew Zepper. He's a managing consultant at Gallup. He heads the European Public Research Engagements for Gallup, which is a leader in individual-based polls and surveys. He leads the global tracking projects with the FAO on measuring food insecurity, gender inequality, and with the ILO and modern slavery and the Walk Free Foundation. Next is Namhla Mangaliso. Am I correct? Okay. She is the director of the African Monitor. The African Monitor is engaged in building an evidence base for policy advocacy, especially involving grassroots research using qualitative data and forming instruments such as the Grassroots Focus Index, poverty hearings, and other ongoing research to inform policy direction and content. To my left is Chernor. He's the youth representative on the high-level steering committee of the UN Secretary General's Global Education First Initiative and is a chair of the initiative's youth advocacy group. He's a vocal and informed advocate highlighting youth and girls' development deficits. And finally, to my left is Gonzalo Fanjul. He's the policy director at the Institute of Global Health of Barcelona. He's also the co-founder of Por Causa. It's a data investigative journalism think tank against poverty. And he's also a research associate with ODI, with particular emphasis on research on poverty, inequality, and migration. So I welcome you all. So just to set the stage, I mean, in 2002, even before that, let's say, standard economic textbook says globalization or international free mobility of traded goods, services, and also, therefore, labor would, in the aggregate, be beneficial for the overall output of the entire sort of global economy. But also, in the sort of subtext of that same sort of standard economic model, we also have this whole notion of that there are distributional elements which could actually temper with the benefits, and the distribution of gains to all is not guaranteed. So there would be winners, there would be losers. An economic model directly does not address this whole distributional aspect. That's left to policymakers, that's left to policy priorities among people. And so that's an unresolved sort of aspect of globalization. Well, what does academic literature have to say? Even as early as 2002, Joseph Stiglitz, soon after, right after he had left as the chief economist of the World Bank, sort of wrote his book, Globalization and Its Discontent. That's 2002, 15 years ago. More recently, he has written a book, Making Globalization Work. It was also, this whole notion of globalization and the aspects of different waves and different sort of influences have been highlighted by Branko Milanovic in his book on global inequality. And there's also fairly robust mainstream evidence of the impact of unequal distribution of the gains from globalization, whether that be protests, mainstream protests on the streets, or Seattle World Trade Organization meetings long ago, to even the more recent sort of waves of moves towards isolationism or trade protectionism. So we have a fairly robust academic literature, as well as some very good anecdotal evidence that globalization has not delivered its true potential across the board for everyone. So we're going to sort of explore that whole issue and sort of pinpoint what, how, in what form, and what could be a good policy response. Where has it worked, the policy responses, and where has it not worked, and for what reasons, perhaps, if we can sort of tease those out. So I'll start with you, Andrew. Gallup is a leader in quantitative data, sort of looking at perceptions. So what do we really know about this, the spread of the benefits of globalization, but also the flip side, the disillusionment of the process, and why is this disillusionment?
So I suppose, sorry, is the
Yeah.
So I suppose we need to keep perspective initially that globalization has actually facilitated the largest ever shift of individuals out of poverty ever seen. But the problem occurs when it's felt that those who've benefited most pull the ladder up from behind them. So Gallup, as an organisation that goes around collecting data, has data to this exact point. And so over the past 12 years, we've undertaken a phenomenal data collection process called the Gallup World Poll. So over the past 12 years, we've been undertaking, on an annual basis, nationally representative surveys in a minimum of 140 countries every year. Through that instrument, we've collected 1.8 million interviews, representative of 98% of the world's population on an annual basis from over 166 countries. We ask a variety of questions, such as on food security, good jobs, perceptions of corruption, perceptions of infrastructure. But perhaps one of the single most powerful questions we ask is for individuals to evaluate their own lives. The Cantrell ladder of life question. Across the entire world, we ask people this pretty simple question, which is, please imagine a ladder. On the rungs of the ladder are the scale 0 to 10. 0 at the bottom represents the worst possible life. 10 at the top represents the best possible life. Where would you place yourself on that ladder now? It sounds like an incredibly innocuous question, but it's incredibly powerful because it correlates very, very strongly with everything that you think would make for a good quality of life. But in addition to that, it also encompasses a few of the behavioural elements. And so this question is so important because it captures the way that people perceive their own lives. And that perception is ultimately those individuals' own realities. So, looking at the applicability of this single question, there's a country which, according to these traditional economic metrics, was going great guns between 2005 and 2010. Between that period of 2005 and 2010, they saw their GDP per capita increase by 30%. They were put forward as the poster boy of the Doing Business Index, of the Global Competitiveness Index. But at that same time, within Gallup's data, using a blended metric of life today and life in 5 years' time, we actually saw the number of people who fit in that top box of thriving drop by 20%. I'd like to hear from the room just quickly who you think that country is. Which country do you think that is?
Between 2005 and 2010, the GDP growth was 30%.
30% increase.
And, but their well-being index, or the people who are considered thriving, which is on a scale of 0 to 10, 8 and above, that actually was falling while GDP on the aggregate was rising. Can you take a guess as to what's that country? Sorry? The UK. India.
Egypt. We also saw very, very similar trends with Tunisia as well. And so that just goes to show that this whole element of focusing purely on economic growth, while not actually looking at the inclusiveness of that growth, can be hugely, hugely devastating for societies. Because ultimately, from the wonks and the policymakers sat in their ivory towers, this was a case study of great, great growth. But for the individuals who are actually living with the consequences of that growth, it felt very, very different.
Thank you. Well, I mean, so Egypt, well, although geographically it's part within Africa, I mean, when people start thinking about Africa, we tend to also reflect more on the sub-Saharan African countries. And there's a wide difference within that continent. So, Namhla, you've looked at qualitative data. And so what does the evidence across the different aspects, I mean, different groups of countries within sub-Saharan Africa sort of tell you? And do they actually mimic some of the sort of trends that Andrew just highlighted? Or are there some really remarkable sort of variances there?
Right. Thank you very much, Soumya. And hi, everyone. So let me start here. I think all in this room believe in some fairly core principles. So freedom, justice, fairness, well-being. And in fact, we understand very well the linkages between those kinds of concepts and principles with general well-being in society and the well-being of people. Which leads to personal fulfillment and the flourishing of the human spirit, as it were. And I think all of us in this room would say those are really important things that we have to have in the world. Except that, of course, we live in a world where we've entrenched the understanding that it's okay for some to have access to those things and some not to have access in those things. And so I want to bring in some perspective, I think, around our own experiences of working with grassroots communities in the African context and what they see to be the reality of inequality in those contexts and how globalization actually affects their lives as well. Let me start with a story, and I hope you're going to give me a little bit of a leeway to start with that story. South Africa is having a really interesting period at the moment because there's a student movement that has risen up in the last 3 years that is called Fees Must Fall, where university students are independently fighting for access to education. So basically, the scenario is that education, higher education in South Africa is quite expensive, and only those who can afford it can actually access it. And so students started mobilizing around this. Now, I am a parent of a 19-year-old child who's at university, and yes, I am that old. And as these fees must fall were taking place, he had to stay out of university last year for about 2.5 months. Now, as an activist, I understand what this is and what the fight is about. But as a parent, I started worrying, is my child ever going to access start thinking about alternatives of where I could send him. So through accessing resources like loans and so on, I could think about free German schools that could take him on so that he can study while I fight the wars in South Africa. I could think about how to get him across the border to Ghana, where universities have a history of really being good and strong. As a middle-class person living in South Africa, I have the kind of access to resources, opportunities that even though I understand the concerns of education in South Africa, I never really have to worry about them for me personally. And my son never has to worry about them for himself personally. He has a friend that comes from a rural village, and I won't mention his name. My son is pretty good in terms of achieving, but this child has had 7 distinctions coming out of school. However, he has a mother that passed away because of HIV and AIDS and had no resources whatsoever to be able to afford South Africa's education system. The fact that his life looks bleak has nothing to do with his capability. It has nothing to do with what he could be in the future. In fact, he could be one of the mathematicians that we need into the future of South Africa. He could be one of the actuarials or a nuclear physicist or any of those things because he has inherent capacity to become those things, but lives in a system that makes it impossible for him to access resources. I have hundreds and hundreds of case studies like this that I could tell you about from various countries across the continent that talk to the essence of inequality. I chose to make it personal about myself, not because I think that story is more important, but because I think it's important to personalize some of the problems we face in the world so that we can find a way within ourselves to start dealing with them. So what are the common connectors around inequality that we are seeing across all of these stories? One of the critical ones, which you will understand from the story I told you about, is barriers to access. Essentially, lack of opportunity. Whether it's lack of opportunity to access resources, whether it's lack of opportunity to access knowledge that enables you to actually achieve the aspirations you have for your own life. But essentially, that barrier to entry is one of the most critical things that grassroots communities talk over and over about in terms of their own experience of inequality. That is linked to the second element that I want to stress, and that's an issue related to power dynamics. And we keep hearing from poverty hearings and all sorts of citizen engagement processes this question around the helplessness to effect changes in one's life. And so the sense that even though you have aspirations for yourself, you have aspirations for your children, you have aspirations for your community, but the structural system makes it such that you can't actually achieve those things. And so that is the essence of powerlessness, not the inability to do, but the inability to access the opportunity to do. And so just from that perspective, from the perspective of the grassroots, I think it's important to understand that we're talking way beyond income. We're talking way beyond just wealth even. We're talking about a plethora of things that have to do with actually creating the kind of environment that allows people to generate their own livelihoods and to achieve the aspirations that they have for their own lives. I apologize, my phone is buzzing. It should be on silent. This is a high-tech environment, though, so I'm allowed to keep my phone open because I want to be able to tweet while we hear some of your engagement. So I don't know if you want me to go into some of the things that we see as potential solutions.
Well, we'll come to that. So just to sort of give a preview, I'll have a few rounds of questions, short, pointed questions, and then I would want to have more discussion with you and among the people here at the podium. So I want it to be as interactive as possible. So we will
let me mention one last thing. So, and I know that we love data. So what's interesting within the African continent, of course, we know that economic growth has been amazing. In the last 10 years, the number of millionaires has increased by 146%, according to data and statistics.
Is this in Sub-Saharan Africa?
This is in Sub-Saharan Africa. And so we're supposed to be doing incredibly well, except the statistics also tell us that if you look at consumption patterns, for instance, a lot of that benefit is accruing to the top percentages, as it were. And so that pattern, you asked the question around whether the pattern is actually similar across the globe. And so I think that we're facing exactly the same things, that when you have economic growth that increases inequality, then you don't solve some of the problems that we're facing in the world.
Thank you, Namhla. In fact, I'm glad you sort of opened up the whole platform to be looking beyond income and wealth inequality to inequality or poverty in a multidimensional aspect, which is what we would want to sort of discuss upon. It includes access to all the basic needs and even sort of the higher evolved needs. So, and Sen, in his famous work, sort of does mention the whole notion of capabilities and agency, and that kind of reflects very clearly or closely to the example that you just gave. Chernor, you work specifically with groups of people who, in the case of Sub-Saharan Africa, are the sort of growing demographic sort of dividend. And the worry is the dividend actually going to pay off, or is it not, I mean, because of lack of access, would end up being more of a burden rather than a dividend? So what do you see are the sort of sources of disillusionment among the youth? Is it increasing? Is it improving? Where are we?
Thank you so much.
Yeah. Hi. Okay, good.
Thank you very much. It's actually it's an incredible privilege to be on this panel and to be with all of you. Thank you for having me. I kept thinking when I was sent the topic of our discussion, globalization and not leaving anyone behind, and this the notion of mass in an era of mass disillusionment. And I kept thinking a lot about the populations that I work with. And I was trying to square this notion of disillusionment with globalization and the reality of the conversations that I'm having around the world. So just to give you a little bit of a background, I work mostly with young people around the world, but my specific focus as well over the past few years has been working with adolescent girls in sub-Saharan Africa. So I try to work with programmers who are providing goods and services to girls and empowering them and linking them with the basic social contracts in their societies. So I was thinking about something that actually energized us as well this morning. We were all asked to stand up, and if you paid for yourself and came here on your own, it's a good thing. We were supposed to applaud ourselves for that because it meant that we cared. But I think in many ways it also reflects this discussion we're having about who is disillusioned and whose voices do we want in the room. While it's in one aspect, it's a good thing, but there are so many people who for the life of God will never, ever afford to get here. And those people who we are not congratulating, we're not pushing out, but as you were saying, the ladder essentially was never thrown to them in the first place. And if you look mostly across sub-Saharan Africa, or if you look at where we have come through, the majority of the folks who are among the young population are girls. Girls in poor countries are the ones who are essentially left out, are the ones who ought to be disillusioned. But what you're seeing is what I refer to as the privilege of disillusionment, right? It's if you already have some voice and you believe that somehow you're not reaching the fullness of your potential. So most of the times what you see in the media, the aggregate of these voices are essentially those of us who have some privilege. Those of us who have access to media in the first place, those of us who have access to be in the room in the second place, and those of us who as we were talking earlier today, even can dream of certain things. Now, my work, as I said, focus a lot with girls, and I was thinking about the poorest girl in the poorest village in the world. I come from Sierra Leone, which is one of the poorest countries on earth, and according to UNESCO, the poorest girl will expect to complete primary school in the poorest village in my country by not until the year 2086 is when, if current trends continue. Now that's how bad, that's how steep the climb is for poor girls, for poor females across the world. Now compare that with the fact that 75% of adolescent girls in Sierra Leone, for example, in Liberia it's 92% of them, will at some point in their reproductive years, if current trends continue, be single mothers. They will be primary providers of the next generation. Now, if you want to talk about people who are left behind, that's the two statistics you should be looking at. It's the people who do not have access to the most basic, in fact, the most basic things that this population needs are now considered in some cases an afterthought when we talk about these issues in some of these global forums, because we just assume that, basic education is somehow, taken for granted. Only 1 in 10 girls in my country will complete school when they start school. Only 1 in 10. This is 2017. Just pause and think about that. If you're a girl, you're inherently at a disadvantage. And yet, you are going to be the providers of the next generation. For me, that's at the heart of the discussion, and that's who is being left behind. It's the people who are supposed to be driving our economies. And you mentioned the demographic dividend across Africa. And across Africa and Zambia, it's about 78% of girls who will be single mothers. That's the trend you're seeing. It's not only that girls are having more and more responsibilities, but the progress we're seeing, the very notion, the notion of globalization. I think you mentioned that when you spoke, Andrew, about the fact that it's been measured and discussed not in terms of the basic welfare of people's lives, and you alluded to that as well, but in terms of things like growth. So just before Ebola struck, Sierra Leone was the fastest growing economy in sub-Saharan Africa. We were the fastest growing economy. But that's only because we started from so far behind that even when we were growing, again, as I said, all of these issues, were leaving us behind. So I think one of the things I wanted to throw into this debate is the notion that what we see in the media and the voices of discontent that we tend to hear do not necessarily translate to the voices that are really being left behind. Because those who are left behind, poor girls, rural girls in poor countries around the world, their voices are hardly even part of the conversation. And that's what ought to change if we really want to have a proper discussion about this issue.
Thank you, Chernor. I mean, this is an era of tweets. But this phrase you actually raised, I mean, I keep coming back to that, the privilege of disillusionment. It's one hell of a powerful statement. It really drives home the point that we are systematically missing out whole segments of chronically underserved populations which are caught in this vicious cycle of staying there for generations. And there is, I mean, I wrote a piece which says what gets measured gets managed. They're not in any demographic census surveys. If you're not there, we did a survey at ODI of the children in the slums of Dhaka. Bear in mind, these are slums, so no official statistic will actually have them on the record. So how can you even capture them on any sampling device? And then you're looking at child poverty and child labor of those. So the government can officially really sort of with a straight face say, we don't have any child labor because it doesn't show up on the stats. But when you actually go to the slums and actually poll the people, the parents or the teachers, they found out there's 14% child labor in the slums. So that's a missing voice, the sort of invisible who are right there, but we don't have them in our statistic. I'm glad you raised that. Gonzalo, in our previous discussion just earlier today, you sort of alluded to this whole debate that you think in your mind about the divergence between what you call rational arguments versus emotive responses. How do you sort of tie up what we just discussed about who's left behind, why they're, what are the dimensions in which they're left behind through that lens?
Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation. So let me tell you where I come from in this debate, because I think it's important to understand, because it's a little bit a different context from the ones that we have just heard. Por Causa, the foundation that we created a couple of years ago, is kind of an institutional experiment. The way we define ourselves is an institution that fights against lies in the public debates on poverty and inequality. That is, we have conceived ourselves as an institution created in an era of the post-truth debate, to put it that way. And the way we work is, for any project we engage in, we put together the capacities of social researchers, such as myself. I am an economist myself, with journalists from very different kinds, from writers to documentary makers to photographers to data analysts, with a third capacity, which is the capacity of storytellers. And I will come back to this point because for us it's critical. So it is not just the story that you want to tell, but how you are going to put it, how you are going to transmit it to a public whose perception of reality is completely changed by. And the one thing that we have found in our work is that facts are and hard data, as Andrew was describing, are the foundation of any informed public debate, are the foundation of anything that we want to reform, of any intelligent conversation on any of the issues that we've been discussing here today. But if there is something that we have learned in the last couple of years, is that certainly in our own country, certainly in Europe and in the United States, that is simply not enough. This is something that we have experienced painfully with Brexit in the UK. No matter what you think about the UK remaining in the European Union or not, the truth is that the quality of the public debate was very low, and we are experiencing it every day with the exercise of fact-checking with what is happening with Trump in the United States. No? So when we engage on issues such as the migration debate, which is the area where we are most active on, what we have learned is that we need to do our research properly, we need to understand the issues properly, we need to use the facts properly, but then we need to move into trying to target the perceptions and the emotions of the population. Unless we are able to do that, it's going to be impossible to try to engage in a reformist or progressive public debate. No? And I'd like to give you a couple of examples of things that are inspiring for us in this regard. You have the example of a country like Canada, for instance, where there are programs that have been critical in building this emotional culture of the population, for instance, during the refugee crisis. The private sponsored program of admitting refugees, where the government created the program, but it is the families and the communities that are admitting the refugees, is completely changing the perception of the population. It's allowing them to understand a reality that in many other countries is completely misinterpreted, no? Which is something that I thought was very inspiring. The other example of emotions that you don't really need to change but to nurture is my own country, is Spain. Spain is a very paradoxical country in this regard. We are a country hardly hit by the crisis, with levels, for instance, of child poverty and exclusion of over 1/3 of the overall population. 28% of the children in my country are living in social exclusion. Still, we are a country that multiplied by 5 the number of migrants living in the country in the first decade of this century, and this is the day that there is no single xenophobic response in our country against migrants. As a matter of fact, a majority of the country, a majority of the regions in the country, 15 out of 17 autonomous communities, have been able to guarantee the universal access for everybody living in our cities, in our communities, including irregular migrants, to healthcare, something that is astonishing because our healthcare system is very good. So we've been able to prove that it is possible. To be frank, if you ask me, I don't know why this is happening. I mean, I couldn't explain how we've been able to avoid this. I'm sure that part of it is that we've been living 40 years in a fascist regime, and there are certain responses that are simply out of the culture of the country. I'm sure that part of it has to do with a lot of the people that came are Latin Americans that speak Spanish and are Catholic, and the integration has been easier in many places. I'm sure there are a number of reasons. But the fact is that we need to nurture those emotions and those perceptions against the hard facts. And the hard facts is that there are a good number of people that are competing right now for low qualified employment in the lower threshold of the labor market, and for very scarce social resources. No? And that's the other thing that I wanted to mention. Sometimes the perceptions are wrong. And sometimes when Donald Trump says that irregular migrants are robbing the employment of Americans, he's openly lying, given that the United States are living in a virtual full employment economy, and migrants are focused on jobs that actually Americans do not want. But sometimes this perception is very real. And what I think is that when it comes to many countries, we as a society have failed to compensate those communities that are losing out, for instance, from a process that is by all means positive. I mean, on aggregate levels, however you consider it, this is the paradox of migration. It increases inequality at origin and destination because the average income of those involved gets lower, but on the aggregate, the process is extremely powerful for progress. So how we compensate those people that are actually losing, how we communicate that, how we make governments responsible in that regard, this is something that we are extremely interested about, because what we are experiencing right now in many countries is a war amongst the poor, rather than a foreign community getting into a country, getting the resources of others. No?
I mean, that's a really interesting point, that it's not just, I mean, typically when we sort of analyze the effects of globalization, we're looking at either sort of critiquing the process or the concept. But there are more elements to it, including the narrative of which goes with it, and less of attention is devoted to sort of analyzing that aspect to it too. That apart from process and the content, there are other dimensions that are just as important to people's perception of what is happening and how it's affecting them.
Sorry, let me add something. Not only there are other dimensions, but that what we are learning, and there are very interesting studies in the UK right now, one by the British Future, what we are learning is that this dimension is proving to be much more important than the other. So no matter what the data says, emotions are playing an overwhelming role in that regard.
Andrew, can I turn back to you? Going back to what we know from the sort of growing the economic process that's happening right now across the world.
So we find that single life evaluation question is a pretty phenomenal umbrella metric for the progress of societies, because it combines both your traditional objective elements with some of those key behavioural elements as well. So looking at the objective elements, we ran an analysis in collaboration with the OECD, looking at what the key drivers of high levels of well-being were across OECD countries. So in terms of the single biggest factor for reducing your level of well-being in an OECD country is lack of access to food. It's probably fairly intuitive. But within an OECD country, if you don't have access to food...
And to highlight, he's talking about the OECD country. So if access to food is that important in an OECD country, I mean, it couldn't be less important in a non-OECD country.
Yeah, and so to that point, in fact, there was a panel at the International Conference of Agricultural Statistics in Rome last year, which actually looked at the global figures for food insecurity and life evaluation figures. And that's something which holds up very, very well across all nations. Access to good jobs. If you don't have access to a good job, then you're more likely to view your life badly. Once again, no great surprises there. Health. If you're in poor health, you're more likely to view your life badly. Safety. If you're not safe in terms of your day-to-day, once again, you're more likely to rate your life badly. So all of these kind of objective, negative elements that can hold back your life. And then on the plus side, some of those positive things that take people's lives from good to great. So having friends to count on in times of need. Being satisfied with the freedom in your life. Volunteering. And so you see there a fairly kind of robust set of elements which are traditionally fairly kind of objective things where traditional policymakers will put interventions in order to facilitate those, probably more on the negative side, but also to facilitate greater levels of social cohesion and social capital development. Interesting is when you start to factor in some of the behavioural elements onto that and dovetail those in. So you look at humans as non-rational individuals. And so looking at some of kind of Daniel Kahneman's heuristics, there's three which really play interesting havoc with the data. The first is loss aversion. So individuals dislike losing things more than they like gaining things. Number two, subjective income. One of my colleagues ran an analysis looking at what the single biggest driver across the world was for this life evaluation figure. And subjective income came up. So it's not directly how much you earn, but it's how you feel about your income. So if other people, your peers, are doing better than you are, then that, in proportion, makes you feel worse about your life. And then finally, this expectation of a better life. So this life in 5 years' time. Do I have a real valid hope that my life is actually getting better? And so it's one thing to put this within the context of, okay, these are hypotheticals. But once again, a real country case study. You look at the political earthquake in the US today. You look at those individuals within the Rust Belt states and the Great Lakes regions that voted for change, voted to upend the traditional political system. It was those individuals that had the worst levels of well-being within the US that were more likely to vote for President Trump. Equally, it was those individuals, even more predictive of just that single figure itself, was if you looked at low levels of hope for the future, was really very, very powerful in making that projection.
In fact, one of the things you mentioned when we were discussing earlier is kind of contextualizing this whole notion of loss aversion and the whole notion of relative income. I mean, you gave an example, if you would want to share that with a person with 1 bedroom and 2 bedrooms, if it just drove home the point really well for me. So if you don't mind sharing that.
Yeah, so my concern with that framing is that it almost kind of trivializes some of these things. But I'll throw it out there anyway. We'll see if it swims. So, okay, loss aversion is the equivalent of if I own a 2-bedroom flat and I have to downsize to a 1-bedroom flat, I'd hate that a hell of a lot more than if I was going from a 1-bedroom flat to a 2-bedroom flat. That's one example. Subjective income is I own a 2-bedroom flat. Everyone else originally only owned 1-bedroom flats, but those other people that did own 2-bedroom flats now have 3. The people who had 1-bedroom flats own 2, and I'm in exactly the same position. And the expectation of the better life is, when I was growing up, I always expected that not only would I have a 2-bedroom flat, but I'd have a 2-bedroom flat with a garden. And now that is just not an option at all. And so it's that kind of putting it back into the context of the way that individuals live their daily lives. So it's one thing to stress the behavioural, but also you very much need to focus on those traditional objective metrics. So the things that really do help people improve their lives on that substantial day-to-day basis. But those behavioural elements explain some of those reasons why we're seeing the factors today and why inequality can be so incredibly disruptive within societies which, when you look at the traditional objective metrics, seem to be doing quite well.
Yeah, I mean, by all means, I mean, it's not to trivialize, but it's just something that we individuals sitting perhaps in this room and sort of watching it online can kind of relate to at a personal level that, I mean, in many ways, this is perhaps the first generation in some countries where the current generation's well-being prospects are actually worse than their previous generations. And we've pretty much been kind of fed on the sort of expectation diet that every successive generation would have a standard of living just as well as, or perhaps even better than the previous generation. And that reality is not bearing out for not just a small portion of the population, but evidence seems to suggest for a much wider proportion, perhaps a majority of people in the countries. Namhla, the evidence that Andrew was citing was partly OECD countries, but you have dealt with predominantly non-cash economies. So, what's your reflection for these sort of issues or the drivers of disillusionment? And you mentioned a few of them in the previous round, but if you can elaborate.
So it's fascinating listening to Andrew and listening to some of the indicators he's mentioning. And so, for instance, he said that part of the indicators for well-being was friends to count on, freedom, volunteering, and so on. And I thought in my head, it's important, and I'm making the point around context and around where all of us are starting and the different places we're starting. In the context where I work, the talk of volunteerism is an indicator of vulnerability and exploitation, as opposed to it being an indicator of well-being. Because if you talk to a young man that's basically done some technical training and has been looking for a job for 3 years, and then you come and say, come and volunteer free of charge, and get into a bus and try and get into the city every single day. Literally, you are completely annihilating his ability to operate in that environment. And so as we work within the African context, we've had to learn how are people describing their own experiences from the ground, and how are the various experiences they are having actually impacting on the kinds of policies and the changes that we need to make in terms of changing structural systems. But let me come much more closely to the issue around global disillusionment. And I wanted to just throw a few issues which are not answers, but rather questions, and some of the things that we're beginning to notice. And so I completely agree, I think, with earlier statements that there are some positives that we've seen from globalization, but here are a couple of paradoxes. And so while globalization allows us to have in front of our faces extreme opulence, the lived reality on the ground is extreme want and extreme vulnerability and exclusion. That's one. Secondly, while the global environment has been talking almost ad nauseum about human rights, and so the right to healthcare, the right to education. And some of the populations I'm talking about actually have now access to technologies in the media that allows them to hear about these things and see these things. So we talk about a world that's promoting human rights, and we've done that in the last 20 years more than we've ever done in the past, except that the lived reality is that those people are not experiencing those rights in their own lives. And so if you talk about access to primary health care and all of these things that we sort of value. And particularly, I think the awareness that only some can experience these things, these good things that we talk about, and not others. We talk about a globalization. I think economists like to talk about the pie that can increase. And so as long as you can increase economic growth, then you can spread it and redistribute it better. And I keep asking myself, what pie are we talking about? When the wealth of African nations actually sits in the bank accounts of European nations. And so think about our taxes that disappear into Scandinavian nations. Or think about the gold reserves of French-speaking African countries that sit in France or that sit in the UK. And so the things that are supposed to enable us to increase our pies are dependent on a global economic system that makes it impossible for African nations who have oil, diamonds, and all sorts of things to actually increase that pie themselves, because we live in this world. And so we can't not talk about how to dismantle existing global and national structural systems that make it impossible for us to leverage on the possibility of increased productivity and therefore increasing the livelihoods and the well-being of people on the ground. So globalization, fantastic in some ways, but a bigger part of globalization has to be asking this question around, we should be disillusioned. We should be disillusioned because the gold of my country disappears into a number of countries that benefit from it, instead of the people in the villages where those gold mines are actually not benefiting. One of the positive things I do want to mention is that globalization, I think, has brought to young people particularly, this possibility of aspirations and what can be. And so this idea that we can mobilize collectively and that we can push back on governments that make it impossible for us to exist, but also that we can push back on partners and corporations that make it impossible for us to produce our own wealth. That possibility, I think, is something that we can leverage, which is a benefit that we are getting from a global world.
Thank you, Namhla. In fact, I'll come to you next, but just as a sort of pointer, when you speak, can you also sort of include a discussion on this sort of decentralized voices that Namhla just mentioned about the sort of the sort of technology-enabled the diversification of the sources of information and voices and opinion, the gains and the pitfalls too. But Chernor, I'm still struck by the phrase you used. Exactly. So, how do you capture their voice?
Thank you. And I think, Andrew, your stats are fascinating. And at some point, I was listening to you, and I wanted to ask about whether there was a gendered dimension to those discontents you're talking about. And I think it fits very well with this notion of the privilege of disillusionment, because you point to the people hate to lose things. And I think you also, Soumya, were also pointing to the idea that for a lot of people, it's a comparison to, you know, where they are, like, and comparison to others. I mean, the example you just gave, you know, if I was living in and again, I talk about adolescent girls, and that's almost always a question that comes forward. People ask about, what about boys? Because the problem is, to complexify all of this, is that there are a lot of inherent assumptions in these conversations we're having, and I think you just alluded to some of them. And in those assumptions, that some countries are more important than others, that capital is more important in most places than people, that borders, the passports you carry, is supposedly more important, and that somehow we have to appease the powerful group that feel that they are losing out on the power that they perceive that they always had, and especially when that power that they're losing out is, they think they're losing out to the outsider, the other. Again, in poor countries, in some cases, it's about boys and girls. It's about men and women. It's the number of young men I talk to across Africa who, when I talk about girls and say we have to change the status quo, disproportionately invest in girls, and people go, well, you know, but all the opportunities are going to girls. In fact, I was on another panel at the UN the other day, and somebody told me that, you know, what's going to happen now, we're facing a new kind of crisis, and the crisis is that boys are left behind. I was like, I wish that was the crisis we were facing. I mean, we don't want that, but that's not going to happen if you invest in girls, because girls pull everybody else with them. So in this, in the West, and I live in New York, and I pay close attention to what's happening with the Trump movement and all of that. A lot of it is predicated on the notion that there's the other that's coming in and taking away these privileges that ought to belong to me. And because of that, the instinct is to revert to more nationalism, and that's why I really like when you talked about values and what our values are, and I think that's what this conversation we need to go back to at the end of the day about globalization, right? Was the premise, or is the original premise and the value system that we come to this with, that every life matters and that we care so much about transforming lives around the world and giving opportunities to everybody? Unfortunately, that's not the consensus at the global level, because I carry a Sierra Leonean passport. Believe me, I know every time I travel around the world that my life is not as valued as the life of a lot of other people. transforming lives around the world and giving opportunities to everybody. Unfortunately, that's not the consensus at the global level, because I carry a Sierra Leonean passport. Believe me, I know every time I travel around the world that my life is not as valued as the life of a lot of other people. And we take for granted the poverty of others and expect that somehow, you know, it should be gradual. You have to understand, you know, and it cannot be at the you know, your progress cannot be at the expense of the other person who is having. So anytime there's an inch towards the people who are left behind making this progress and the other person, somehow you have to do, you know, your economists will say redistribution. And because of a value system that has taught people over time, and again, it's not only in Middle America, it's also boys and girls, it's also males and females across societies. There's this notion of the grievance then gets, and if that value system does not exist, especially in a capitalist society like the United States, where capital and this false notion of if you work hard and play by the rules, you're going to make it, you know, the people, if you look at every data in the US, the people who are actually really left behind, poor females in inner cities. These are the people who have been left behind from, you know, over time and over time. But they, again, they are not the voices that are particularly captured in this era of discontent, except you're beginning to see now that movement, because even the voices that are captured, you know, before it was a Tea Party, it was a well-funded, very organized, by very rich people who obviously are benefiting now. They are all in the cabinet. These are all billionaires who are benefiting from this new. So the irony is that the discontent, the beneficiaries of the discontent are the billionaires, because we go back to the system that values not people, but capital. And I think that's, I would like for you to talk about the gender dimension of that. And for me in the work that I do, and I'm very proud to say today is actually my first day at my, I just founded my a new NGO that's going to focus specifically on girls in sub-Saharan Africa called Purposeful Productions. And our work is going to be around those two things, about giving girls opportunities, but also about transforming perceptions about what is needed within society. So engaging in creating a movement to transform the power structures and give girls opportunities. So I think that's what really needs to happen on the grassroots, and that's what I'm dedicating my own life to as well.
Gonzalo, coming back to you, you termed it as the crisis of the intermediaries, kind of reflecting on that. And I can already see sort of the new media Slido sort of questions coming up from the audience. And after your questions, I mean, we'll sort of open up the panel and we'll have to start dealing with the pressing questions that are coming up there. And the substance of some of the leading questions is, okay, we've talked about the concept, we've talked about the sort of the issues involved, but how do we get it moving? How do we reach those who we need to convince? How do we actually sort of make the storytelling or the narrative drive? So soon thereafter, I mean, we have just about 25 minutes left after this, so we'll have to start
I will respond
to the questions.
Also taking the first question, because I think that is a very important one. So I do have this sense that maybe, forgive me because maybe it's very stupid, very basic, but I have this very strong sense of what I would describe as a crisis of the intermediaries. So I have spent most of my life working in NGOs. I was head of research at Oxfam for over a decade in Oxfam, Spain. And in the last years, I have been working a lot with journalists and with the media. I've developed an entomological interest for journalists in this last. And I see them very similar in this regard. Somehow, for a number of reasons, I would certainly highlight two: the fact that there is a crisis of legitimacy of the intermediaries, the fact that people are perceiving that they are losing their credibility, sometimes because they are very openly taking sides on certain, I mean, what we are seeing in the United States or in certain debates.
Gonzalo, can you just elaborate on who are you defining as the intermediaries?
Intermediaries. No, I'm using two examples of intermediaries in this case. Large development NGOs, for instance, that would be one. The other would be the mainstream media as intermediaries. So intermediaries we used to need in order to do the kind of things that we now perceive that can do ourselves. Okay? And this goes from getting the information that we can get in the social media in a very atomized but in a very affluent way, to the very fact that we can organize, that we can use change.org in order to organize our own campaign. We do not perceive that we need the intermediary that we used before, as we used to do before, in order to influence this situation, the reality. No? And I will not get into the reasons for that because I'm conscious of the time. No? But if there is something that we have seen very clearly that we are observing, is that, in my view at least, the intermediary is more necessary than ever, precisely because there is an atomization of the information, precisely because there is an atomization of the possibilities, that is more difficult to discriminate what is true and what is effective. We need the help of credible, legitimate intermediaries in order to do this work. And this is happening somehow through the traditional side. It is very interesting to see, for instance, how the numbers of subscribers to the New York Times or the Guardian have increased after the Trump election. The case of the New York Times, over 100,000, I believe, is the number. But I am also very interested in the way this situation is forcing the reality in a different direction, and this is related to what you were referring to, the decentralization of some of these processes. For instance, I am following very closely what is happening in Latin America with the creation of a new generation of media organizations that are actually financed by philanthropic organizations like the Open Society Foundations, the Soros Foundation, or the Knight Foundation, or even others. So do not depend on what the readers pay, but on philanthropy as NGOs. These are public service organizations. I'm talking, I don't know if there are Latin Americans here, but La Silla Vacía in Colombia, El Faro in El Salvador, Plaza Pública in Guatemala, Animal Político in Mexico. These are all extremely high-level media organizations that are doing as intermediaries the work that the mainstream, that the old media has decided not to do. No? And Africa is an extremely interesting example in this regard as well. In this case, as far as I know, not necessarily through very well-structured media organizations, but with individuals, bloggers, for instance, that are playing an extremely interesting role in shaping the public debate. No? So when we are talking, now the question left, but when we are talking about tools...
How can you improve the storytelling or the narrative?
How can you improve the storytelling? Well, it's very difficult to respond. I can tell you the things, just one example of one thing that we are doing with the Overseas Development Institute. You were mentioning that I am an associate with the ODI. We have started this conversation that hopefully will be a project where we are involving other organizations as well, where we want to influence the migration debate, taking as a starting point the enormous potential and possibilities of migration for development. We want to change the conversation in two different ways. First of all, trying to influence the narrative from the emotional side, and therefore involving actors that are not necessarily part of the conversation when we talk about migration and development in usual terms. For instance, marketing experts. So not just academics and experts on data, but on the more theoretical aspects, but academics, of marketing experts. The other element that we are exploring that is extremely interesting in this regard is whether we can change the interlocutors. So whether, for instance, we can get ourselves far from the radioactive electoral politics of migration at the governmental level, and instead of that, start talking to cities. Cities are playing an extremely interesting role in
right now is
Voices.
impacting youth.
Right. Okay. So the first question, I'll just answer that very quickly around storytelling and voices. We find that in our experience, it's less about telling the story on behalf of, and it's basically building those spaces or strengthening those spaces where the people who experience the story are telling their own stories and speaking straight to power. And so bringing young people to sit at the African Union or to talk directly to ministers seems to work quite effectively in generating the kinds of changes we want to generate. How is globalization impacting youth? I think we talked a little bit about this, but the point I wanted to bring is that the positive, maybe also negative side of it is that it's helping to agitate young people and impress upon them the possibilities. And I think someone else said that in the questions here, that globalization opens up the world so that you can see the realm, of possibility. But because the nature of globalization is that it brings some of the dichotomies I was talking about straight to your face. And so you are bombarded with people who live fancy lives when you don't have access to that. And that's part of the agitation. But of course, the positive side of that coin is that then it's allowing, or rather creating an incentive for young people to mobilize and act collectively to push back some of the systems. There's a question around preaching to the choir. How do we stop preaching to the choir? You know what? I think it's a valid question and a valid frustration, but I'm not sure that we're preaching to the choir. I often, working in civil society myself, I'm often aware of the level of change that we must make ourselves, because oftentimes we recreate the same inequalities that we're trying to solve in the world. And so the very way that we are behaving as development activists and development practitioners often is counterproductive to what we want to change. So we're not converted yet. I think we're trying will behave. So we need to keep challenging ourselves and keep talking about these things, because we are the ones that need to change first if we're hoping that the greater world is going to change as well.
Andy, can you share some light about, from your experience, what policies have governments, or I mean national or subnational or local, have they adopted to kind of manage the disillusionment? Not really manage in the sense that kind of brush it under the carpet, but in terms of actually seriously redressing the imbalance. It could be, I mean, you could highlight some of the successes, or maybe one or two things that didn't work out, and perhaps a reflection of why it worked or why it didn't work. I mean, just
via the gender topic, in fact. So the question was, in terms of that gender disaggregated data, do we have that? And so one of the beauties of our approach is that because we randomly select individuals at a household level, we can disaggregate data via gender, age, income, etc. And so the question was, how do women view their lives across the world? And actually, almost too well compared to how it should be, given those drivers. It's one of the interesting nuances that we're still kind of wrestling with. Soumya acquainted with the data as well, that women actually rate their lives slightly higher on a global basis than men, despite all the inequalities, despite all the prejudices they face in their daily lives. They're still that little bit more happy about their daily lives. And so whether that's down to the resilience or their ability to bounce back against these, that's one option. ILO Guy Ryder, Nobel laureate Angus Deaton, tech entrepreneur Sheila Marcello, and Ava Longoria launching this global report on what women want from the workplace globally. And so hopefully that'll get close to us understanding why women do view their lives that little bit better.
Please,
Yeah,
please. Yeah.
If you don't mind, Andrew, were you done?
So I was going to go then address Soumya's question, but please.
Okay.
No, I was just going to say something slightly provocative. So basically, back to the bigger point you had made, it's actually old white men who are disillusioned, right?
No, I'm disillusioned too.
Well,
I don't think I'm old. Please don't.
at least beginning from a position of privilege and feeling like that privilege is challenged for many women across the world. It's only in recent decades that you're seeing more and more women, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, getting into the workplace and into the formal workplace, I should say, because obviously women, my grandmother has been, was the matriarch of her family, took care of her entire family, but it was never considered work, right? So all of these things that are happening now across the world, you can see, this is why I was going back to this notion that it's, if you look at, and I think there's a question here about how we change the story and what the implications are for young people. One of the things I was going to point out as well, related to that, is I really think that the way we tell the story, we should move away from, in this discourse, from kind of representative postering. And we talked about young people at the UN, at the AU. That is important, and I should know, believe me, my entire life has been being in front of these audiences and representing young people in children's parliaments and African youth parliaments. I've been president of all of those. But I know that that is, and that's typically what we do to then celebrate ourselves. Oh, look, we have young people. Oh, look, all these young people that came in the room today. Oh, look, great. But where the difference in both in how we tell the stories and how we're going to make a change is how do we really transform structures at the local level, at the very local level, to make sure that in that community leadership council, you have girls' voices, young people's voices, to make sure that what passes for youth, and I know that whenever we talk about girls, oftentimes a lot of my friends who are youth leaders, as soon as they start, my friends who are youth leaders, as soon as they start talking about youth, they're only thinking about the male youth in Africa. And whenever I push them and say, but everything I just talked about is also is included in that youth group, people kind of forget that sometimes. But I think that's what we need to change. It's about the voices in the room, and back to this privilege, and aggregating the voices of the invisible and the voiceless, and making sure that they are part and parcel of the conversation and are part of how we hold up
And to be fair, I mean, different societies and different countries have different attitudes and different appetites. And someone actually earlier in the country, I mean, in today's sessions, did mention this, that what passes off as just, quote-unquote, reward, let's say in US versus in other societies, not perhaps the right way of sort of addressing the root cause of increase or decrease or high levels of it. That's just my quick take. Anyone wants to take any of the other sort of challenging questions up here? There's a question on globalization with good governance and rule of law. How do we align them? And part of the story could be better information or media or something that we haven't discussed. Anyone?
Let me say something about the second one, the role of the UN in bringing up the SDGs when governments manipulate the perception of the population. And my take there would be that even with the most collaborative governments, the communication of the SDGs is extremely difficult. I mean, this is an agenda that is completely atomized, that is talking about everything. I challenge you, except for culture, to mention one single issue that is not covered explicitly by the SDGs, that is related to, I mean, that is inviting governments to an exercise of cherry picking in many cases in the implementation of the. So I would say that. I think that this is one of the issues that I do not, I mean, I don't know, I don't have the solution for it clearly. We are struggling with it in Spain very harshly. It's impossible to open a conversation about the SDGs, even within the social sector, not just the development community, but the social sector in general. And we are going to need to be extremely creative in order to translate this to transmit this to the society in any useful way. No? So it's not just the problem of governments that are opposing it actively, but the agenda in itself is going to be extremely difficult to communicate. No?
I mean, I wish we could continue this discussion. It's been really fascinating for me sitting here, but we're kind of running out of time, and we've gotten the signals too. So I also realized one thing, that I never introduced myself. So like all sort of fancy newscasters, they say, and this is such and such. So let me just take a plug and introduce myself. I'm Soumya Chattopadhyay, and I'm a senior research fellow at ODI. And previously, I used to be a senior research associate at Brookings and the World Bank. And so it's been an absolute privilege to have not just the four of you, but the entire audience here. My take on it is we've just started the conversation, and just because we are hitting 5 o'clock does not mean that it ends here. I really encourage you to sort of take this discussion onwards, even in an informal setting, but it was fascinating. Thank you all.